Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. This series of webinars is run by radical feminists whose voices have been canceled or silenced in universities, schools, and media. Frustrated that we cannot share what we know in these places, we're offering this online series of webinars here. This morning, Kate Newey will be discussing restoration comedies.
Right, shall I get going then? Are we ready to start? And I will share my screen. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me back. Whoops, I need to get right to the beginning. Thanks for having me back, and it's always just such a privilege to talk to everyone. I kind of feel this morning I'm doing the light relief after the last few weeks in talking about a period of British culture and theatre that where women became very visible. And in many ways, this is a kind of a good news story, although the women I'm going to talk about, you may not have heard of, you may, I hope people have. And we want to kind of wonder, where did these hugely successful playwrights go? And as I was thinking about preparing this talk, I thought about Dale Spender's book, Mothers of the Novel, that was published way back, I think, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, where she writes very energetically and enthusiastically, as she always did. I had the privilege of hearing her in seminars and so on in Australia, where she's kind of looking back to say, here were these very active women whom we've lost, and sort of just reminding us about them, but also asking questions about why we have lost these names. So I've called this talk Mothers of the Theatre. The first thing to say about these, I've picked three playwrights who are probably the best known both in their own lifetimes and now. The first thing to say is that we're looking at a period of English theatre where women were quite successful. Susannah Centlivre's plays were second only in popularity to Shakespeare. And one of the illustrations on this slide I'm showing you here is of a 19th century, an 1890 reprint of her play, A Woman Keeps a Secret. Her plays were still in the repertoire, really right up to the end of the 19th century. And similarly with Elizabeth Inchbald, she worked at the end of the 18th century, first as an actress, but then much more successfully as a writer. And she was probably one of the first published female theatre critics. And on this slide, you can see just a photograph of some very handsomely bound books. It's part of a 25-volume set of Inchbald's theatre. And as you can see from my slide, I mean, I just Googled this yesterday. It's on sale in aid books for £395. It's a pity she didn't get that money, but certainly she made a lot of money by collecting together plays and writing prefaces for, I think, around about 200 plays in the end in all these collections. She wrote a 1 to 2 page preface, which, as you can see there, was advertised as "With Remarks by Mrs. Inchbald." So this is a good news story. The next thing to say is it is also the period where the sex-based stereotype of women working in the theatre as, you know, actresses equals whore, to use the word that was used in that time. We would probably prefer to say prostituted women. And I've got here some pictures of the actress Nell Gwyn. The historical portrait is after the very famous portraitist Peter Lely, I think it's a Dutch name. And the fact that he was painting her portrait shows the level of her status. And this is status as an actress, also long-term mistress of Charles II. But I don't know if anyone in Britain, and I think there's been a production on Broadway in New York, I don't know if anyone caught the show at the Globe and then on the West End of London, a play by a wonderful young writer called Jessica Swale, who also wrote a play called Blue Stocking about women studying at Cambridge at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century and agitating for the right to take a degree from Cambridge. But she wrote a play called Nell Gwyn, and it focuses on Nell Gwyn as a highly skilled comic actress and also as an entrepreneur. And I just point to a couple of women who I'm not talking about this morning, but Elizabeth Barry and Anne Bracegirdle, who were women theatre managers. They were actor managers in the late 17th century, so in the 1680s and the 1690s. So I really want to sort of put at the centre the skills of these women, their work as actresses, their work as entrepreneurs, their work as pioneers in a very particular period of British theatre history. And I want to talk a little bit about that first before I go on to look at some of the plays of the women I've chosen to talk about. So a little bit of background. We might remember from, if you sort of, you know, had a British education, there was this thing called the Restoration. It was the restoration of the monarchy. What really, and I find working with my students at university on this period, is they don't remember the time when, or they're not taught, well, obviously they won't remember, it's 400 years ago, but they're not taught very much about the time when the island of Britain, it was often called England, but covered Scotland, Wales, England, and the whole island of Ireland, was a republic. It was called a Commonwealth at the time. The apparently monarchist British chopped off the head of a king, Charles I, and Oliver Cromwell led what were known as the Parliamentary Party. This is the period when Ireland is colonized. It's a partly religious war. Cromwell is a Protestant, and his invasion of Ireland with Scots Protestants is partly to try to convert Ireland away from the Roman Catholic Church. And part of this is a strategic thing. If you've got Catholics in Ireland, apparently with their allegiance to the Holy Roman Empire and the Roman Catholic Pope, then Ireland is a kind of a setting off point for mainland European Catholic countries to invade England. I mean, this is a kind of national, international kind of strategic policy since really Henry VIII and certainly Elizabeth I. Anyway, so what's extraordinary about that period is that the kinds of things that we take for granted, the public theatre and so on, are closed down. Public theatres closed for about 20 to 30 years in the middle of the 17th century, so 1642 right through to 1662. And I think that nowadays, well, I suppose if the theatres closed nowadays, there would be an outcry. But I think it indicates the importance of the theatre in this period, right through really to the 19th century, as a place where people congregated together. And the theatre of Shakespeare's time, for example, the public theatres, were places where all classes met. Obviously, how much you paid indicated where you sat. So although somewhere like the Globe or the Curtain or any of those, the Swan, any of those theatres of Shakespeare's time brought together audiences across the classes, they were segregated within the theatre and where they sat and so on. But there's a sense that this is a communal activity, and in some way the theatre operates as a kind of space for public opinion and often opposition to power in certain veiled ways. But the theatre is a place of satire. It's a place of comedy, and within comedy you can make political comments. You can go under the radar in the spoken language. And the legislature in Britain is always running to catch up with what people are saying on the stage. There is censorship of the theatre, particularly after 1737, but it's always running a little behind what the people, what the theatricals are saying on stage. Because if you're pretending to be someone in Spain or Portugal, as we'll see later on in some of the plays I'm going to talk about, then you can say stuff about England that you couldn't say if you were putting out, say, a political pamphlet. Because, you know, if the censors come along, if the kind of the law, the regulators come along, you can put your hands up and say, oh, it wasn't me, I was just pretending. You know, and it's this kind of ability for the theatre to be quite fluid in its political kind of allegiances that I think is really interesting and something worth remembering. The theatre was quite an important part of the British political nation. So one of the first things that Charles II did was to reopen the theatres. You can see here a document that is held in the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's called the Letters Patent, and he gave it to Thomas Killigrew, who probably also was a spy for him in Europe. And he said, you have permission to set up a theatre in central London. It's what became the Theatres Royal at Drury Lane, and then Covent Garden, and then the Haymarket. And dotted about the whole of the island of Great Britain are Theatres Royal. You know, the Theatre Royal in, where have we got Theatres Royal? We've got them in various towns and cities, market towns across Europe. Some of them still survive. And these were given the royal imprimatur to perform the theatre. Other theatres emerged to, particularly in the 19th century, but these were often what were called the illegitimate theatres. And there's a whole legal battle I won't go into. But so the theatre is this really interesting, non-parliamentary, non-monarchical, although supported by the monarchy in certain ways, kind of element for public opinion and often satire of the current power, the current parliamentary power, and available to all the classes. Paid a penny and you could go and sit up in the gallery and watch the latest play. So the things that were important for women and women's work in the theatre, and I find that by talking to my undergraduates about the idea of work in the theatre, we get past the whole sexualization and celebrity culture that builds around the theatre, but it is there. One of the really huge changes for the restoration, this 1662 reopening of the theatres, was that women appeared on the public stage in Britain for the first time. Now, mainland European theatre people thought that we in England were really weird, that only young men and boys played female roles prior to this. So all of Shakespeare's plays, you know, Juliet, Cleopatra, all of those were written for young men. maybe up to about the age of 21, 22, the kind of feminine young man, who probably still does drag nowadays. What we also get is a change in the kinds of theatres, and the slide here is a drawing of the kind of very architectural theatre that we have. Most of Shakespeare's plays were played, if you've ever been to the Globe on the South Bank of London, it's an outdoor theatre to all intents and purposes. There's an awning over the stage, but most of the audience is not under a roof. Theatres played in the summer, in the winter, they went indoors into the court theatres, and these were not the theatres that were the theatres for the popular audience. So theatre did still survive throughout the time of Cromwell's Commonwealth, but it survived in the royalist strongholds, in the great houses of royalist aristocratic families across Britain, and in recusant Catholic families. And there's quite a bit of writing by women, theatrical writing by women in this period. And we're pretty sure they performed, but in these private theatricals in the aristocratic houses, when they weren't under siege from parliamentary and Commonwealth armies, So once the theatre comes back to London and becomes public, it moves indoors and it becomes a very urban theatre. And it's why we tend to think about the Restoration period of theatre as producing comedy, and it produces the comedy of wit, the rakes, the fops, and these are all male type roles. And it's really, I always think of it a little bit like the 1980s, the kind of greed is good sort of kind of celebration, I suppose, of excess. But what it allows is women to appear on stage as women. And this has some really interesting consequences for the kinds of plays that are written. Female roles become bigger in all the plays, and they offer a greater emotional range to women. So one of the things you notice is that you get really witty female roles. You also get some wonderful roles for older women. You also get, within the witty roles for the young heroines, you get what is called the gay couple. Now, that doesn't mean same-sex attracted. It means a heterosexual couple where the man and the woman are equal in wit and intelligence. And if you want a really good example, William Congreve's play, The Way of the World, has a wonderful scene where the hero and heroine negotiate the terms of their marriage. And okay, the marriage is a legal contract, it's about property, it's about money, but they negotiate the emotional terms of their marriage. And the heroine, Millamant, negotiates that she will have a room and space of her own that will be entirely female, and her husband won't be allowed in there, and so on. So it's really interesting what starts to happen. Of course, this is not, I'm trying to sell this as a good news story, but this is not the sort of utopia for a female community. And what you notice in this picture, which is actually an illustration of one of Aphra Behn's novels that became a play, Oronuku, is that when you get real women on stage, I hate using that term, when you get women on stage, their bodies are visible. And so you see here a woman shown in a kind of costume that seems to reveal her thighs, seems to reveal her the bottom half of her body in ways that might in normal life be forbidden, You also have, and we'll see this in one of the plays I'm going to talk about, is that there's in a lot of comedies, there is the ravishment scene, basically a rape scene or an attempted rape scene. You often also have various female characters who cross-dress. Now, instead of those being young men playing young women who play young men, as we get in something like, for example, the Shakespeare As You Like It, or Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, where the heroine in both of those, played by a young man, in a situation that is unsafe for a young woman. So the character, the theatrical character, decides to cross-dress as a young man. So it's this double cross-dressing. The cross-dressing in the Restoration period is an opportunity to show off a woman's thighs in breeches and her breasts, because there's generally an uncovering scene where the young man supposedly is revealed as actually a young woman, and usually revealed by ripping off her shirt, and you see a flash of near to naked breast. So, you know, women are still kind of inculcated into the male gaze. And, you know, I think this is part of why the sort of stereotype of these women is that they were on stage, they were performers, but that was little better than prostitution, this showing off their bodies. I think this is still an issue for women working in the theatre and film industries, and indeed the music industries today. And we see the kind of horror when women, I remember once when we saw, really famous actress putting her hand up to Julia Roberts, putting her hand up to wave at fans, showing that she had hairy armpits, for example. You know, this outrage at a woman not presenting her body in this hyper feminine way. But, and here's where I start on Aphra Behn. Aphra Behn, according to Virginia Woolf, and according to most historians, is really the first woman that we know of in English literary history to earn a living by her pen and by her own name. And here's the lovely quotation from Virginia Woolf in her beautiful essay, A Room of One's Own. And that essay is Virginia Woolf. It's a series of lectures to young women at Cambridge, where she argues that for a woman to become a writer, which she argues is an extraordinary profession for women, that a woman needs a room of her own and to earn £500 a year. And of course, Virginia Woolf was freed from earning by inheriting from her father, and she's writes in her diaries that, you know, her father's death sadly made her career possible, which just shows you the kind of, still by the end of the 19th century, the power of the father. But I think it's really beautiful. She says, all women together ought to let flowers fall upon the tomb of Aphra Behn, which is most scandalously, but rather appropriately, in Westminster Abbey, for it was she who earned them the right to speak their minds. It was she, shady and amorous as she was, who makes it not quite fantastic for me to say to you tonight, earn £500 a year by your wits. And Aphra Behn is in the National Portrait Gallery in London. She was self-educated, like most women of the period. In 1663, so in her early 20s, she travels to Suriname, and this probably influenced a very popular novel she wrote, very early version of the novel. She was probably also a spy or an informer for Charles II against the Netherlands in 1666. And there's a whole side issue there about her need to earn money, and she spent money going to the Netherlands and, trying to get to talk to people, probably people she'd met in Suriname. And then she got back and was completely disowned and sued for the money they owed her and ended up in debtor's prison. But she was part of a group of radical literary Londoners. And for example, there was a warrant for her arrest in 1682. So again, she has to leave England, but she comes back. She writes at least 18 plays that we can trace, and there are a few more where her authorship is possible but not certain. The play I'm going to talk about, because it's the play that is in the repertoire still. The Royal Shakespeare Company did a production of it just a few years ago. It's a play called The Rover. And it's got all the elements of the kind of restoration comedy in the way that we think about restoration comedy. The rover, the rake character, women on the tear. It's in Carnival. It's a comedy where Carnival allows the whole world to be turned upended and reversed, and chaos ensuing. This is just the start of the plot, and honestly, I'm not going to go through the whole plot because it's so complicated. I always tell my students in the beginning of each act, there's generally a speech where someone gives you the story so far. But really, the plot in all of these plays, the plot is just a vehicle to carry lots of other stuff. And I think the other stuff in this play is that we have the sisters, Helena and Florinda, just love the names, who are being organized into their futures by their father. So Helena is raised in a convent and she's facing making her vows to stay in the convent. Florinda, her sister, is supposedly being forced into a marriage by her father, and it's to a marriage to a much older man. But, even her brother wants her to marry someone, his mate, Don Antonio. Florinda actually loves an English colonel called Belleville, and the names are always a giveaway here. Belle, as in beautiful. So, he's a bit of all right. And it's Carnival in Naples. And I think it's really important that these plays don't happen in England, that it's somewhere else. So an English audience can kind of go, oh yeah, all right. Over on the continent, they get up to all sorts, but it gives the audience and the playwright and the performers a kind of license to mess things up. So they all, the three women, Helena, Florinda, and they go out with a cousin as well, Valeria, all put on masks and go out into the street, which is not normally something they could do. And they meet up with a group of young men, also on the tear, out in the streets, masked. And Florinda sets up a tryst with Belleville to meet her later that night in her garden, and that leads to the very typical rape scene in the play. But I'm just going to give you some examples of some of the speeches for women, because I think what we see is the possibilities here for actresses, and I'm sorry, I'm still using that term because it just delineates, that we're talking about women performers and the skills that they develop. So this is Helena in rebellion against her father. Dost thou think that I'll ever be a nun, or at least till I'm so old I'm fit for nothing else? Faith, no, sister. And that which makes me long to know whether you love Belleville is because I hope he has some mad companion or other that will spoil my devotion. Nay, I'm resolved to provide myself this carnival, if there be e'er a handsome proper fellow of my humour above ground, though I ask first. And I think this is really interesting, because here is a woman openly stating desire for a handsome young man. She doesn't want to be celibate for the rest of her life. She wants a bloke. Now, these plays are all hugely heterosexual, and that's just the structure they're in. And the other part of the typical comic structure is that young lovers are always blocked by elderly fathers. And the idea, one of the theories about comedy, is that what it gives us is the younger generation necessarily in protest or rebellion against their elderly parents to find the heterosexual pairing that will combine love, and as we come into the restoration, money becomes very important, that will allow them to have a great marriage, reproduce, and produce the next generation. So not marrying an old man who's going to be incapable of sex and making them pregnant, marrying virile, handsome young men, and then they'll go and have lots of sex and lots of babies. And so I think this is really interesting that these plays that Aphra Behn here is writing, she's allowing a certain frankness about female desire to emerge. And here you see a typical, this picture is taken from an American production of The Rover, but it's really typical of the kind of costuming that contemporary companies love with The Rover. The tight bodice, the lots of breast on show, which is unfortunate, but it's our kind of stereotype of the Restoration theatre. The other major female character in The Rover is a famous courtesan, a prostituted woman, Angelica Bianca. Although what's interesting is she uses prostitution as a financial business proposition, and she is advertising during the carnival. And she's also represented as in competition to the so-called good women, Helena and Florinda, for men's attention and money. And she pursues both the brother and the supposed husband for Florinda. But she pursues them because they are rich enough to pay for her, and she charges by the month. So she's a kept woman. And she says, not many men can afford me. And in fact, she does fall in love with the rover, the rake of the play, Wilmore, and admits that she's in love with him and loses all her business nous in consequence. So as I say in my slide, the action of the whole play is directed towards marrying off the appropriate heterosexual couples. But here's Angelica talking about what she thinks about men, and she's talking to her maidservant. And one of the things about these plays is the roles of the maidservant are brilliant roles for comic actresses, because they are the confidants of women. And what you see in all these plays is the relationship between women. So Angelica sort of basically says, I'm resolved that nothing but gold shall charm my heart. And her maid says to her, I wonder what has kept you from the general disease of our sex so long. I mean, of being in love. And Angelica says, a kind but sullen star under which I had the happiness to be born. Yet I have no time for love. The bravest and noblest of mankind have purchased my favours at so dear a rate. So she's kind of saying, I don't have time for love. I'm going to exploit men for money. I mean, it's the argument that is still used in the sex work is work argument nowadays. But I think it's given a space here that's slightly different, I hope. Or, one could interpret in this way. And this is the wonderful thing about the theatre. An actress playing Angelica could go through a whole process of thinking about her character and representing the character in a way that sets up Angelica as interested in the power over men who are rendered powerless by desire. And indeed, in The Rover, there are various scenes where men are humiliated and objectified almost as much as the women are. And there's particularly through a subplot involving Angelica Bianca. But we still have an attempted rape scene. So I said earlier on that Florinda sets up a tryst with Belleville, but Wilmore enters drunk, sees Florinda alone in the garden, and assumes she's a prostitute. And this is the dark undertone of many of these plays, that women who are in public, frank about their desires, trying to, run their own lives instead of having their fathers run them, are vulnerable to being picked out as the bad women rather than the good women. And again, I think it would be a very interesting contemporary production that tries to break down that binary between the good women and the bad women. I'm going to move on now because we're at 10:30. I'm just going to have a look at the chat and see if there's oh wow, yeah, and I know someone's picked up the point that I tend to use the term actress. I'm sorry, it's habit. But when I want to talk about the kind of specifically female-centered view of all this work, I find it just easier. I'm sorry, I will learn better. And I've seen there, people talking about Aphra Behn being a spy. She probably was. And I just think, and various people have written plays about her. I think there's a movie in there, a really popular kind of daring do movie about Aphra Behn. So my next example is Susannah Centlivre, and she's probably my favorite of the women I'm talking about today. She was self-educated. She comes from a farming family in near Bury St Edmunds. And what's really interesting about that, there's a theatre there that was built in the 18th century that for a long time has done readings and performances of a lot of the women that were writing at this time. So they're trying to keep people like Centlivre and other women writers in the repertoire in Bury St Edmunds. So if you live anywhere near there, I don't, I live right across in the West Country. If you live anywhere near Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, keep an eye out for what's going on there because they do a lot of work around this in getting these plays up on their feet. But it was part of a touring network of regional theatres. And so she probably got into the theatre by joining a company of strolling players. And she excelled in what were known as the breeches roles where women play, part of the female character's job was to play men. She first wrote under a married name, Mrs. Carroll, and it's uncertain about whether her final marriage to Joseph Centlivre was her second or her third. Sometimes women working like this were not necessarily married, but they adopted the Mrs. title, partly because in the 18th century, a bit like in France or Germany, once you're an adult woman, you're called Frau, not Fräulein. You're called Mademoiselle rather than Mademoiselle, or Madame rather than Mademoiselle. So a lot of women, adult human females, even though they weren't married, were called Mrs. And it's a kind of shortening for mistress, meaning adult woman. Anyway, by the early 1700s, Centlivre is in London, and she's part of a Whig group of London playwrights. Her first real success was with a comedy called The Gamester. But I want to talk about a wonderful play called The Wonder, A Woman Keeps a Secret. And it became one of the most popular plays in the English language repertoire, right through to the end of the 19th century. Again, it's a play set not in England, in Portugal. And it really plays on the idea that in Portugal, they keep their women cribbed, cabined, and confined. So Isabella is confined to her father's house to be married to an older man. You can see the pattern. She escapes, and I love this. She just jumps from a window, and she's caught by Colonel Britain. He is an English colonel, and he's a big, strong man because he catches her. He's the hero, and he takes her to the house of Violante, who is the sister of Felix, who's a friend of Colonel Britain's. You can see these are complicated plots. They don't really matter, actually, except as a way of getting the action going and getting the women active and the men falling in love. Colonel Britain, in the course of taking her, I mean, physically carrying her to this other house, falls in love with her. Felix comes to visit Violante, finding the colonel there, thinks that the colonel is being entertained by his lover, Violante, and gets hugely jealous and storms off because Violante will not break Isabella's secret. Because what happens is Violante hides Isabella away from her father and this Don Guzman, the old rich man that she's supposed to marry. And even to the point of losing her lover, because Violante loves Felix, and you know his name, Felix, good, joy, felicity. Again, the names tell us everything. Even to the point of losing her lover, Violante does not give away Isabella. And I just think this is beautiful in a culture where supposedly women are in competition with and hate other women. You know, supposedly the heterosexual economy of love and marriage supposedly sets women against each other. But here is Centlivre writing a play where the two women, Violante and Isabella, look after each other. I just love this. I think it's wonderful. And I would love to see a kind of a version where the ending is changed and, you know, Violante and Isabella become the paired couple at the end of the comedy. I think that would just really, I mean, you'd have to sort out a whole lot of stuff, but I just think that would be a really interesting contemporary play on the possibilities and the potentials that Centlivre is giving us here. I'm not making the claim that she's a kind of secret lesbian. I don't know. You know, I mean, she's writing within a kind of normative heterosexuality of comedy, where, as I said earlier, part of the function of comedy is to kind of have this jolly romp, but in the end, everyone has to be paired off appropriately. And those people who do not conform with their culture, and comedy sends everything into a kind of rebellion, but it's very conformist at the end. We see the way that people are punished for not conforming. So older men who think that they are going to be good husbands for young, beautiful women are often humiliated in these plays. They're often made figures of fun. Another play that Centlivre wrote, Bold Stroke for a Husband, has the beautiful Anne Lovely, which is her name, playing off various suitors and also showing the ridiculousness of her 4 elderly guardians in trying to control her life. So, sorry, I realise I'm talking on and I've got 10 minutes to finish. So here's Isabella talking to Violante about the force and the coercion of women. So here's Don Guzman. He's arrived from Holland to celebrate nuptials. Having no hope left me to escape the marriage, I leapt from the window into the street. I just love that. But, you know, she's running from a forced marriage. So there's a really dark reality that is at the kind of foundation and is made fun of, I think, in these plays. But I do think that Centlivre understands what's at stake here in a way that possibly male playwrights don't. So this is Isabella talking to her maidservant Inez. And here she is. You are pretty much right in the right, Inez, but to be forced into the arms of an idiot, a sneaking, snivelling, drivelling, avaricious fool who has neither person to please the eye, sense to charm the ear, nor generosity to supply these defects. And then she goes on with a wonderful bit that says, "What pleasant lives women lead in England, where duty wears no fetter but inclination. The custom of our country enslaves us from our very cradles." And I can see that getting a roar of approval in a British theatre with an English audience. But also, there's a space in there for English women watching this play or reading this play to think, not sure about that. So I think this is the space that theatre offers, because it isn't one single narrative. There are different characters saying different things. And this is, I'm sorry, I'm gone way over time and I don't have time to read all these scenes. I'm happy to send the slides to anyone who would like them. But you can see Inez and Isabella talking about their kind of utopia. Let's not go to a monastery, but what would you do? And Inez, the servant or the maidservant, but she's more than that, says, what would you do? And Inez says, "I'd embark with the first fair wind with all my jewels, and money is important here, and seek my fortune on t'other side of the water. No shore can treat you worse than your own. There's ne'er a father in Christendom should make me marry any man against my will." So again, we have the working class woman with perhaps more freedom than the woman with money. And always the heroines in these plays are either seeking to marry the man they love but keep their fortunes, or marry the man they fancy who's also rich. And one of my students once said, when we were looking at this material, they're very venal, aren't they? And I had to say to her, well, I think really right up until last week, if you're a woman looking to marry, the man you marry is one of the most important economic decisions you might make in your lives. And I think to a certain extent for heterosexual women, this is still the case. That marriage is an economic as well as a kind of a love relationship. And we may well have been fooled by romance into forgetting that. These plays are very pragmatic. So my final, I'm going to whiz through another East Anglian or Eastern Suffolk woman is Elizabeth Inchbald. For some reason, again, Bury St Edmunds was quite an important theatre in the circuit that went around the whole of the east coast of Britain, and it was quite a wealthy area. So it features in much of the theatre history of this period. So Elizabeth Inchbald is probably one of the most financially successful women that we're talking about. She works in the theatre at the end of the 18th century. So it's in this movement between the pragmatic, robust comedy of the 18th century and the Restoration. It's moving into the sort of sentimentality of the Romantic period. And she writes in both modes. She worked in the theatre, and she's very frank in her, she wrote a kind of memoir, which you can find on Google Books. And she's very frank about the casting couch. And she says, I stopped, I started to move into writing once, a theatre manager cast his latest mistress instead of me in a role that he should have cast me in. Although she was never a really great actress. But she gradually moved to writing as a way of increasing her income. By 1789, at the age of 36, she could give up acting. And so, for example, her farce, I've noted here, made £900. And the way that playwrights were paid in this time was that if a play lasted more than X number of nights, they got an amount. And the more nights the play played for, the more they got. They didn't get a kind of royalty per performance. They got a lump sum on the third night, the sixth night, the ninth night. Or they could sell the play complete to a theatre manager, and it then became that manager's property. So once you were quite famous, you could negotiate and say, you're going to make loads of money out of this play, so you need to pay me £500. So that's the way the economics worked. She also goes into writing, I don't know if I've got time for Lovers' Vows. Oh, I do. She also goes into writing critical work, and as I started at the very beginning, she wrote a 1 to 2 page kind of remarks, which is really literary criticism, for every play in her edited collection of kind of great theatre. So here's a woman writing literary criticism of all the great male playwrights, from Shakespeare, Marlowe, Thomas Kyd, all of those sort of, the canon of English literature. Here's a woman giving her opinion and being paid for it. And those plays, those volumes, I've got some wonderful, they're in another bookcase I can't show you, but I've got, it's several meters of shelf space of these collections. She was first employed by a publisher called John Bell's British Theatre, and then she strikes out on her own and publishes Inchbald's Theatre. And these were sold often as a place for reading, for amateur theatricals and so on. So the play that is probably the one that it still roughly remains in the repertoire is a play called Lovers' Vows. It's translated from the German of August von Kotzebue, Das Kind der Liebe, the Child of Love, which is part of a kind of a romantic movement in Germany at the end of the 18th century called the Sturm und Drang, Storm and Stress. It's where we get the Caspar David Friedrich paintings, and there's this kind of, she's writing in the same sort of intellectual realm as someone like Mary Wollstonecraft, for example. But Lovers' Vows is really fascinating because it starts with this great monologue, which I won't try and read, by Agatha, who is a fallen woman who was left pregnant and alone by Baron Wildenheim. And the action of the play has 2 plots. The action of the play is Agatha being reunited with her son Frederick, as you can see in one of the pictures there. This is from an American production. And Frederick hunting down Baron Wildenheim and seeking justice for Agatha, seeking Wildenheim to apologize and marry his mother. So we have a fallen woman center stage as the heroine. We then have the final scene of the play, and here's a drawing from a publication of the play, where the Baron is persuaded by his, at this point, illegitimate son to meet with Agatha. I did a production of this with my students, gosh, about 20 years ago. And when we rehearsed it, the young woman playing Agatha, who was wonderful, in precisely this scene, we almost staged it exactly as this picture. So it tells you something about the kind of internal logic of the writing. And we were playing around in rehearsal, and I said, let's just improvise this in your own words. And the young woman playing Agatha, actually, at one point, when the young man playing Baron Wildenheim, and unfortunately he didn't really have the kind of sort of age and gravitas that perhaps Baron Wildenheim needs, the young woman just looked at the young man and just said, no, fuck off, in that language. I'm sorry for the language. So we played with that. I mean, this is a comedy, it's a sentimental comedy, so it comes to a happy ending with the Baron and Agatha reunited and then married, and then Frederick coming in going, I hear the voice of my mother, mother, father. So we have not just the heterosexual couple, but the nuclear family. But I think it's hard to really underestimate how radical this kind of ending, particularly as it's given a very contemporary setting in the text itself. It's not somewhere in Portugal 300 years ago, it's now. It's the play that is stopped halfway through Jane Austen's novel Mansfield Park, for all sorts of reasons that I don't have time to go into now. but it remains in that repertoire. And it also shows us that Jane Austen herself was very fond of the theatre, knew a lot about it, went to the theatre a lot, and was reading this kind of stuff. You know, and I kind of tend to think she probably also read Mary Wollstonecraft's writing, but couldn't say so because Mary Wollstonecraft was a real life kind of fallen woman. So that is a rattle, you know, a kind of a rattle tour through some really prominent in their time playwrights, women playwrights, who hang on in the repertoire by a thread. As I say, The Rover is the play that remains most centrally in the repertoire. I would love for the National Theatre Company to do proper feminist productions of some of these plays. There are companies around. There's a group called Red Bull and another group called Hedge Pig Theatre in New York City, who regularly do readings of this lost repertoire of women's work. David Gregg up in the Lyceum in Edinburgh is trying to, because there are many more playwrights than I've talked about. So there's a huge kind of hinterland of women's writing for the theatre that I think is just ripe for revival. And I have to say, when I've worked with students on these plays, particularly the Centlivre texts and Inchbald, but the comedies, they perform really well. And the kids love playing them. Once they get through the language and they get the language in their bodies and they learn, you know, you have to cut and you have to edit. But what they really enjoy is that these are very robust plays. They're not namby-pamby sentimental plays about women and men. They're very frank, and they give opportunities for women to talk about desire, about you know, often the women in these plays, and particularly in Centlivre's plays, they really fancy the men that they want to marry. There's desire there. And this is so rare in literature and theatre. So I just put it out there, you know, I mean, get reading them. I mean, I've put this last slide. Whoops, sorry, I'm trying to look at the chat. But I found when I was looking yesterday, I realized I wouldn't have time to show you some scenes, but there's various footage on YouTube. There's a really good website set up by a lot of feminist scholars actually on 18th century theatre called the R18 Collective. You can read the plays, they're all out of copyright, so you can read via Google Books, Hathi Trust, the Internet Archive. And LibriVox does some really nice, they're volunteer readings, their quality is variable, but if you want to hear the plays read out loud, LibriVox is really good. It's free to it, it's free, there's an app. So I will finish sharing my screen there. And I don't know if there's any questions that Marion or Sheila have found in the chat. I think we've got 2 minutes to go.
I don't have any specific questions, except that in relation to the last woman you were talking about, was the play by her that you were looking at, or was it one of the ones she collected together? I couldn't quite work that out.
Oh yes, sorry. Lover's Vows is an adaptation. It's a translation, but it's really she's rewritten. So it's one of the plays she wrote. Yes.
Ah, okay.
And I think it's really interesting that that Jane Austen picks a woman's play to put into Mansfield Park, even though in the end it's a play that stopped. Yeah, it was a pretty common practice to translate and adapt plays from French and German, and just shows, you know, the skill and the intellectual intelligence and sort of so on that Elizabeth Inchbald had, as many of these women did.
So she had German and was able to read
Yeah.
the play and written.
And I mean, my German is scratchy, but she actually did change quite a lot from what I picked up from reading the German.
And the original German play was by a woman as well?
No,
Oh,
man.
okay.
Yeah. But a very popular playwright, you know, and there were various translations of that particular play, but it's Inchbald's that's stayed in the repertoire.
Yeah, absolutely gripping. I had no idea all of this was going on. I knew about Aphra Behn because, you know, us 70s feminists tended to know about her, but all the other stuff and
Yeah.
the significance of all of this, I had absolutely no idea.
And you can see, hopefully didn't whiz through the slides too fast, but you can see once you get through the language, it's really playable and funny.
Some of the language was a little tricky in the bits you were putting up.
Yeah.
Slightly trickier even than Shakespeare, maybe, or maybe not, but a little bit tricky.
You have to get used to it. You have to cut.
Yes, absolutely gripping. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's such a privilege. It's such a privilege to talk to everyone Sunday mornings. So thank you all for being here.